Now, if you speak about capacities and skills against this background of science for policy, of course, you are talking about the people having these skills and the people needing the skills, of course. And it is all about communicating the ability to speak with each other. And coming from different backgrounds, in this idea of, so there is a planet policy making and a planet research, it is also about language. The language we share or we don't share sometimes. And it is also about experience. And some of these experiences can be taught. Some of them, however, have to just be made. And this is part of what we are talking about. Oh, I already see there is one online guest. He is connected. You can't see them yet, but he will be coming up. So sticking to this idea of that there is sort of a planet science, a planet policy making, which is of course nothing more than a metaphor. But sometimes there is this difficulty to speak between these two worlds. And well, just a question to the audience: has anybody coming from one planet or the other, or maybe from both planets, has anybody ever made this experience that it is difficult to talk sort of to the other side? Just raise your hands. Well, most of you haven't, which is a sign that we're on the right track, but it's still interesting to debate and to make it much better. So we're here to show that both planets can actually communicate and quite a substantial and structural way. And it's about essentially turbocharging science for policy with skills and competencies. Look, this is about policies and instruments that help develop people's knowledge and experience to engage in scientific advice for policy making. An obvious example, of course, are fellowships, for example, and we will be talking about that later. But also, how can professionals gain exposure to science for policy? Dealing with the communication between both worlds, it of course goes both ways. How can scientists learn the skills necessary to communicate with policymakers and vice versa? Now, we will have room for questions from the audience. We also use Slido, so a very warm welcome also to everybody who's following us online. Those online can ask questions through Slido, of course, and you can also, if you prefer, to ask questions through Slido. The code is here, but I think everybody has it by now because we're deep into this conference already. Now, we have a great panel here. And it's a very international panel, which of course in the EU setting is sort of the most banal thing to say because it's always very international panels. But this one is an intercontinental panel. So, hailing from Australia, but with a full career in Europe, our first panelist really straddles planet science and planet policy making, always at the interface and always never in one sector, rather connecting people. And as a climber and boulderer, she knows about climbing up, falling down, and climbing up again, which is a necessary skill which comes in very handy in what we're talking about here. The policy manager of the European Geoscience Union, please give a very warm welcome to Chloe Hill. And to further boast with our super intercontinental character of this panel, not only coming from the other side of the Atlantic, but actually connecting from Washington, D.C. Somebody who not only manages Science for Policy fellowships, I hope he'll be appearing right there. I can see him here. He not only manages Science for Policy fellowships, but he has actually made the journey from planet science to planet policy making through one of those fellowships himself. Please welcome the Senior Policy Advisor at the US Department of State, Scott L. Sellars. Our third speaker is all about engaged research, driven by the spark in people's people when she sees that we can make things happen, we can make the world a better place. Somebody who really believes in the power of doing things together. The head of research, education and public engagement at Science Foundation Ireland. Please welcome Liza Higgins. And last but definitely not least, our fourth speaker does fit a little bit into this imagined world of planet science, even if constantly reaching out to the other planet policymakers, directly from academia, from a university, and getting many ideas on early morning runs. And when I say early morning runs, this is really early. It's like 5 or 6 in the morning. I don't know if you have ever tried. The head of the Mercator Science Policy Fellowship Program at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Tome Sandevski. Now, we have a whole sort of landscape of tools represented here to steer this conversation between policymakers and scientists. We have 4 outstanding speakers. So let us first delve a little bit into the people and their specific motivations. Now, I asked the audience if they have ever made the experiences of the difficulty to communicate between planet science and planet policy making. Just the same question for you. I'll raise your hand if you have ever made the experience that this could be difficult. Scott? All 4. Well, that is a great starting point here, of course. Liza and Tome, both of you, when we had calls earlier to prepare this meeting, told me about something very similar, which was the experience to have worked on a big science project, years of research, and then it basically, as the former French President Jacques Chirac used to say, it made psst, it didn't have any impact. Could you say a few words on this? Maybe Tome?
Well,
they are all handled by the technicians. You don't have to switch, press or buttons. You can just talk.
all right, because I'm not sure that whether it was me who said that he was working on a big science project.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
did I get this wrong?
So maybe Lisa wants to start, and I can jump in later. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
This absolutely point taken, Liza.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was me either, but but what I will say, I suppose, is I work for Science Foundation Ireland. We are a funder across all areas of STEM and across all types of research. So frontiers research, big centres, industry partnerships, career grants, everything. And I suppose what I'm talking here today about is some of those maybe a little bit more innovative, a little bit to the side kind of initiatives that we're doing. So I suppose to your point, Olaf, I guess we fund a lot of research, a lot of big projects, and really what we're trying to do at this point in time is to crystallize some of those ideas, crystallize some of those really great research projects that have come out maybe of many years of research and bring them at the appropriate time to policymakers and other stakeholders beyond academia to ensure that they do deliver impact. And I suppose that's where that engagement piece we can talk more about.
It can absolutely happen. But Tome.
Yeah, sorry, Olaf, you were right. I used to work on a project, but it was policy-oriented research. It was about higher education finance, and it took me about a year to write a pretty lengthy report on matched funding schemes. It was a pretty good report, and I think it was a very reasonable one. And actually, my co-author and we were warning that some developments or some legislation the German government was doing in the late 2000s would not have the intended effects, and I made the experience many scientists do. I was right, and no one cared.
Now, as I already have to admit that something must have gotten entirely wrong in my preparation if I come up with questions that are not at all. I might as well go on once your preparation is ruined. Chloe, was it you?
It might have been me. So, I mean, I can think of an example that I might have shared with you. This is back when I'm from Tasmania. In my undergrad, I worked for Forestry Tasmania for the Conservation Research Department, and I collected beetles as part of a big research project. And essentially, it was a really long research project. I came in right at the end of it. And I did, compared to the actual research, as I was, just a student, did very little research on it. But I remember there was a very distinctive sort of takeaway messages. And that at the end of the day, nothing was done with them. And this was research being done by a government department, essentially, or a funded government department. And this is when I was still, doing natural science research, and I was a bit shocked by that. And it did encourage me to go on and study more social science, political science. And I think I've always carried that with me in the sense of I understand the frustration that a lot of scientists feel when they do their research and they think it's really important and they don't see this change happen. And so I can really empathize with them, but now from the other side, from the side that's connecting with policymakers, I totally understand why that research wasn't used. It wasn't communicated. It wasn't shared with the right people. It wasn't relevant. And so that was a bit of a learning curve for me. So maybe it was me that you would ask.
Got you. Well, thank you very much. Scott, I already alluded to it. You benefited from a fellowship program yourself and became a manager of fellowship programs. How did it feel for you to sort of transition from planet research to planet policy making?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear on stage. Can the audience? Just give me hands up. Yes.
Okay. And there is about a 1.5 second delay. So if I seem to be going on and on, sorry about that. But no, thank you, Olaf, and such an honor to be here on this panel with such distinguished panelists. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. But to your question, yes, I like to say I'm a researcher masquerading as a diplomat. I came from university. I got interested in policy really through my educational training in weather forecasting. So I was a meteorologist, an atmospheric scientist, and had to translate very complex forecasts to decision makers. And there was something about that experience that really just drove me to want to understand how policy was made, how decisions are made. And so I fortunately had a number of these different fellowship opportunities that allowed me to embed myself within policy. And, I always thought that I was someone who, kept track of, the news and international affairs. And what I quickly realized when I had kind of moved into the full policy world was that I actually had very little idea of what policy is. And it wasn't until I had to, work on legislation myself or advise a principal here in the federal government that it really kind of hit me of all the complexity that goes into policymaking and decision making. And so thankfully, those fellowships allow scientists here in the US to experience that and be able to take that back. Some end up staying in government or in policy. Others go back and do research or go back to their traditional field. So it's a little bit different for everybody, but those opportunities are extremely important in bridging that gap between science and policy.
Chloe, was that an experience you can relate to when you think of your sort of coming from a scientific background, moving to policy making?
I would say not me personally, but maybe if we could also move in and talk more about these fellowship programs that we've been involved with and pairing scheme programs that we've been involved with. And the organisation I work for, the European Geosciences Union, we do have a pairing scheme, and I know that scientists who have participated in that pairing scheme have gone on to do more policy-related work. Most of them have actually stayed within the scientific community. They're still doing research, but they do have this better understanding of how to connect with policymakers, how to make their research more policy relevant. And they just think about their research in a different way because they have had that experience. And I will say the pairing scheme that the EGU does is very, it's very short. It's only a week inside the parliament. I know Tommy does a lot of different ones, and I'm sure he'll tell you about those. But even just this week, this very short experience of being in close proximity to policymaking, to understanding what the policymaker needs, can really change the trajectory of a scientist's career and also help to sort of more integrate that thought process into whatever team that they are working on as well.
How does it work exactly? It's 1 week at the European Parliament, wasn't it?
It's 1 week inside the European Parliament. So this particular pairing scheme is probably, I know it's a little bit different to the one that Tommy does. We're actually in the process of doing it now. So it's with 2 MEPs this year, so 2 members of the European Parliament. We select them based off which ones are interested in participating. I will say something I learned quite recently, I learned yesterday, is that these pairing schemes wouldn't happen if I wasn't in Brussels making those connections individually. So you really need this knowledge broker person to be able to set these pairing schemes up. It's not something that a scientific organisation can do if they are not in Brussels, if they are not making these connections. So we set those connections up. I sort of have more of a personal relationship with these MEPs and their assistants and really hold their hand through the process. We open this application process up to all of our scientists to make them aware that these policymakers inside the Parliament do want to speak with them. They do want to listen to the science. Which
do
again,
they?
They do. They are interested in it. And I think that for some scientists, they don't realise that. So even having the ability to apply for a pairing scheme like this, even if they're not selected, it opens up that opportunity for them in the future to look out for those opportunities or to see them when they wouldn't have seen them before. So, yeah.
One point of which I am quite sure that you were the one saying it was because we were comparing when we spoke before the European Parliament and the European Commission. Could you say a few words on that?
I can. So I would say with this pairing scheme, it's something we set up initially in 2018. I really wanted to do it with the Commission. I really wanted to put a scientist inside somewhere in the Commission. This was a bit naive of me, I will say. The Commission is much more structured than the Parliament. And I think that is really, really positive in a lot of ways. There's a lot more institutional scientific advisory mechanisms that exist in the Commission for scientists to engage, and these informalised processes might be a little bit more difficult or like just not random people entering a building. I did try and talk to the HR of the Commission and they were just like, no. But with the Parliament, because it is much more informal, and again, that does have its drawbacks, but it is much more informal, so you can really approach individuals who can say yes or no. So, yeah.
Yeah, it has drawbacks, but perhaps also sometimes
we can talk about those.
Open
sure.
doors. Tome, your pairing schemes work in a different way. Could you just say a few words just on what you're actually doing? How do you bring these 2 worlds together?
Of course, we are currently running 2 pairing schemes at the Frankfurt Rhine-Main universities, which is an alliance encompassing the universities Frankfurt, Darmstadt and Mainz. And we have one pretty large one, the Mercator Science Policy Fellowship Program, and we are also running a pilot scheme funded by the European Commission, the Science Meets Regions pairing scheme. And they are quite similar. So the basic idea is that we circulate or disseminate calls for applications to policy-making institutions, which are usually ministries, agencies, but also DGs of the European Commission, international organizations. And we ask policy-making professionals who are heads of units to apply to our program and to submit lists of questions or topics they're interested in. And once we accept the policy-making professionals into our programs, we organize face-to-face meetings with our researchers at our universities. So the policymakers, they visit us twice a year, and during each visit, each policymaker conducts some 8 face-to-face meetings with researchers. So this is what we are doing in a nutshell.
And are these sort of moderated debates, facilitated groups, or is this basically 2 people in a room and they discuss what they think is interesting?
Yes, it's basically 2 people in a room. So the setting is very informal, and it has advantages because both people or both sides can talk in a very open way. And our researchers tell us that they really appreciate this type of setting because unlike hearings in a parliament or unlike official presentations in ministries or similar settings, they can speak in a very free way. And also the policy-making professionals, they usually talk very openly about their work, and it's very interesting for the researchers to learn how ministries in Berlin or how the Brussels bubble actually functions.
What are the main topics of these debates?
Well,
of these meetings, rather?
We say that the policymakers, they can ask all questions they're interested in. So we have topics from like architecture to zoology. We have basically everything, but there are big topics which are especially popular, like digitalization, the rise of populism, political reforms, political communication, climate change, energy transition. So these are very popular topics.
So this is clearly not only natural sciences, this is clearly also social sciences. I'm getting there.
Yes, in fact, 50% of the researchers participating in our program have a background in social sciences, about 20% have a background in economics or business, and about 20% have a background in STEM subjects.
Lisa, bringing these two worlds together in Ireland.
Yeah, so I suppose we have a few different ways that we're experimenting and we're trying out things, but most, I suppose, similar to some of the other speakers, we have a fellowship program. Interestingly, the first time we ran the program, actually also back in 2018, it also included similar to the previous session, the Parliamentary Research Services. So we also placed researchers within the Parliamentary Research Services in Ireland. So it gave them the opportunity to learn how that works. And that was a very successful initiative in itself. And I think particularly speaking to that part of the program that we ran, it was a really fantastic opportunity. I mean, the parliamentarians working and also then the Oireachtas Library and Research Services, the parliamentary services provided. They were very generous with their own time in working with the researchers. I think this is critically important. It's very much a two-way stream. So really important that they give the time for training, for orientation, for explaining how processes work. And I think that kind of opens up that black box that we hear the whole time people talking about when they're interested in working with policymakers. But on the other side, a slightly different slant, I suppose, is we work across many different government departments and government agencies. And I suppose similar to yourself, we ask them to submit areas where they feel researchers may be able to contribute to their agenda. Now that may be twofold. That may be either because they really need that wealth of information and that up-to-date information in order to inform policy that they're involved in shaping, but equally it involves them working alongside to bring new skill sets into the organisation and to help them to appreciate how new technologies like artificial intelligence and others might actually help them to deliver their job better for the delivery of public services. So there's it takes different formats, and I think the impact can also be really very far-reaching and wide depending on the particular setup.
Now, Ireland is a fairly small country. What does that change, or what does that perhaps facilitate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very much enabling in our case. I mean, some of the initiatives that we're involved in, it really is quite straightforward for us to make those connections. It doesn't mean those connections are happening organically, because like I said, we do hear about the black box on the ground. Yeah. But I mean, for example, a few weeks ago in our offices, we were able to kind of bring together a large group of heads of units in government departments, together with researchers, and people are accessible. So we can get them together, and they're very willing and able and wanting to participate. So I think that context is important. I think, as we were talking beforehand a little bit, there is seemingly encouragement needed at a very, I think to Chloe's point about this wouldn't happen if I wasn't in Brussels. What we also find is that if we as the funder didn't go out to the institutions and talk to researchers and encourage them and ask them whether they might be interested, it really isn't necessarily on their radar, or there's a little bit of a feeling of, I don't think that's for me. Now, of course, if it's not for you, that's absolutely fine. But I think some of it is actually just that leading a little bit of confidence and a little bit of encouragement to realise, and then the fruits of that come out in the end, I suppose.
Chloe, I see you nodding.
Nodding a lot, yes.
Seems you have something to add.
I'm just nodding. I think it's like this important role that, like, this knowledge broker term we've been hearing about a lot the last few years. I think it's sort of the practical application of that. And I do see a need for more of these knowledge broker positions that are in a paid position where they can build those connections, build those bridges, because without them, these initiatives wouldn't exist. And I think from the scientific organisation perspective, we do need to encourage scientific organisations to recognise and reward this sort of work. And I don't think it's happening enough. I know we've heard a lot today already that, you know, a lot of people who are working in the Commission in Brussels really are prioritising this kind of work. We need to see the same thing from scientific organisations.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Scott, I just had, Liza just described that being in a fairly small country sometimes makes things much more easy. I did the comparison, actually. The US has 65 times more inhabitants, so that's an advantage you don't have. California alone has 8 times more inhabitants as the Republic of Ireland, at least. How do the fellowships work in the US? How does it work concretely? How do you get people on board?
Yeah. Yes, it's, you know, there's so many different diverse scientific communities that have varying degrees of interest in policy. And I would say over the last really 30 years, I think most scientific societies see some value in, you know, engaging policymakers and decision makers on, you know, the different types of discoveries that are coming out of their communities. You know, and to Chloe's point, it doesn't take a lot to get people interested, or at least to highlight, you know, what policies like, so that a person or a researcher can decide if that is something that they want to really engage with more. Personally, I was a second-year graduate student and was able to attend the American Meteorological Society's Summer Policy Colloquium, which was a 10-day immersion in DC, and they take 10 different graduate students, 30 different professionals, and they drop them into DC for 10 days. And that was just kind of that moment of like, wow, this is really fascinating work that happens, you know, in the federal government and in Congress, and I want to learn more. And of course, I went back to my dissertation and had lots of research questions that I was still very passionate about and still am to this day. But in the end, that kind of, you know, that experience of being able to, you know, think that, wow, I could actually engage in policy just continued to intrigue me. And so then that I had to look for other more longer term and paid opportunities so that I could transition into policy. So it doesn't take a lot, and every community is experimenting on different types of programs to engage their researchers and scientists. And of course, in the end, it's up to the student or the person that is having that experience to decide if policy and politics is something that interests them.
Could you say a few words how this dropping into Washington, D.C. actually works? Are you sort of a group being guided around by some sort of knowledgeable person, or are you having sort of given a schedule with meetings?
So it's very different depending on the agency. I'll just speak very quickly about the U.S. Department of State. We've been in partnership with the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the publisher of Science Magazine, since 1980, where we, you know, the Department of State hosted 3 fellows per year at the time. And now it's well over 30 per year, where we bring in PhD and experts to work as officers, as foreign affairs officers in regional bureaus, in country desks, in functional bureaus that work on specific policies like climate change or non-proliferation, many other foreign policies. And so what essentially happens is there's a recruitment process through a scientific society, and it's not just AAAS. We actually work with many different scientific societies to do this recruitment, and they help to find the fellow, and then they interview across the different offices of the Department of State to determine their interests and the joint interest in hosting that fellow for a year, and potentially up to 2 years, depending on you know, the work in progress and interest of the fellow. And then they're essentially a member of the team. They are dropped in, and they're given a portfolio, and they're asked to take on responsibilities. and they have a mentor to really help guide them through that process. I've seen this be extremely successful, and I've seen some really challenging situations where researchers and fellows in these types of environments don't quickly adapt to the dynamics of policy and politics. And so every fellow is different, every office experience is different, but in the end, it's an opportunity for these researchers to really experience foreign policy. And AAAS partners with over 40 federal agencies. And so we place fellows or AAAS places fellows, the Department of Energy, NOAA, Department of Commerce, Department of Justice. And so lots of agencies are involved in these types of fellowships.
Tome, when we spoke, you spoke about the different languages these two worlds are using. Could you say a few words on that? How to translate, basically?
Oh, translating is actually very difficult, and we made the experience that scientists and policymakers often use the same terms in a different sense. For example, I mean, a good example are the terms long-term and short-term. So if you talk to a scientist from climate science or to a historian, short-term can mean decades. And when a policymaker talks about short-term development, he or she thinks about days or maybe even hours. So there are these types of challenges, but also terms like regime, institution, significance, risks. So there are often terms that are used by scientists and policymakers in a different context, and even by scientists from various disciplines.
And also, most of these pairing schemes somehow allow scientists an access to the policy-making world. But you also said one thing, which is actually policymakers don't really understand how science works, and that they sort of tend to misinterpret scientists as think tanks. Where do you draw the line exactly?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I have to admit, I really do not know where to draw the line between think tanks and applied research and frontier research or basic research. And I mean, we are explaining to our policymakers that university researchers have their own research agenda, which does not have to cater for the needs of policymakers. So we are not think tanks or consultancies or communication agencies. So we tell the policymakers participating in our programs to think about rephrasing the questions and to think about the meetings with the policymakers as kind of a puzzle. So each meeting is going to add a piece to the puzzle, but they should not expect to receive an overview or the whole picture by talking to one scientist.
When we're speaking about this skills, what are actually the skills that are needed? What are we actually talking about? Liza, perhaps a few words.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose, first of all, there's just a knowledge gap. There's just information on how legislation works, and people will go in and actually just not understand at all. And there's actually just training and information and knowledge exchange. I mean, I think when it comes to skills development, and I might come on a bit later to talk about another major initiative that we're running, but as part of that, we're doing a lot of skills development. So as part of this major initiative where we're putting together many different research teams working across different disciplines, and these can include as well policymakers working alongside scientists from different areas and engineers and policymakers or others beyond academia that really understand the challenges and the problems that they're trying to address. And before I go down the route of talking too much about that in detail, but to talk about the skills development that we do, we very much, like in SFI, we talk about investing in the team. So we really work with them. There's a strong sense of engagement. So that brokerage piece, we meet regularly. People on my team meet regularly with the research teams, maybe every 6 weeks. We instill a very strong sense of encouraging them to engage outside of their own fields. And they really are tasked with doing that. But we don't just tell them to go and engage.
But
we provide them with the skills. So we provide them with design thinking training. We design them. We work with them in developing things like theory of change. So if they really want to make a difference with the research that they're doing, is the framework there for them to understand how they do that, how they engage with stakeholders. We actually, with Scott on the line there, we engage with some trainers that we have worked with through the National Science Foundation in the US. So we're a small country, but we still work very closely with the NSF. And we really try to help people to understand how to do stakeholder engagement, how to understand who they should be talking to. And by having, in some cases, policymakers involved working with those research teams, they're able to really join the dots. They're able to connect the researchers to who they should be talking to. But we really recognize that that skills development piece needs to be there. It's not necessarily natural for everybody to be able to get out of the building as such and talk to others.
Policymaking.
So it is something that can feel uncomfortable for some researchers coming out of the lab. But I think by really working very closely and providing that skills development, it's been very effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And I'd also just add, I mean, the skills to engage in policy making from a scientist perspective, the JRC has done a lot of work on this. I think most people in the room have heard of the competence framework, science policy competence framework that the JRC developed 2 years ago. 27 different skills outlined. But I think understanding what those skills are is one thing. And firstly, most scientists don't know what those skills are. They have to sort of, be aware of them first. But then actually engaging in policy is almost a different thing. Putting those skills into practice in a team that is supported, initially quite supported, like you were saying, really, really important. And once you've done that, for a year or 2 years or something along those lines, then those scientists who have done that work can take those skills away and work with their other team and say, I know how to do this now, let me show you. So, yeah.
Scott, when you spoke about the fellowships, I understood that these are yearly fellowships, sometimes even 2 years. What does that imply for the career of researchers? Sort of, is it okay to stray out of pure research and to engage in a fellowship for a year or two in policymaking in the US?
That's a great question. Very challenging question because it's quite personal, frankly. If you look at the trajectory of a researcher or someone interested in science and technology, you get a STEM, you have an interest in STEM in high school, you go to college and you take a major, and then you have, or maybe you've had an internship and you've started asking some scientific questions that you're looking to answer. So then you go to graduate school and you refine that and become an expert. And then you go to a postdoc, right? And then you hopefully find a professorship somewhere and you move in. Moving into policy, you can do that at any point in time in your career. And I think historically we see a lot of, late career experts start to engage in policy or be appointed to different boards and commissions and advisory committees within the government. But these fellowships now we're seeing have substantial young, early career researchers. And by stepping away from their research, right, they're not publishing papers as much. When I did my fellowship, it took me 1.5 years to finish one of the publications I was doing in my postdoc, while I was a fellow. And I was allowed to publish that, thankfully, because the Department of State said I could. But at the same point, maybe other agencies don't allow their fellows to publish, right? So it's going to impact your research career. But in the end, it's really that personal choice to be able to decide whether or not the policy engagement and the policy experience is worth those years of research. And that's going to be very individual and very based on someone's experience and what they see and want to do with their career. So it's a very challenging question. It's going to be different for every community and every person. But I hope at least that gave you a flavor of my thinking, Olaf.
Could one imagine a world where it is more okay for researchers to sort of engage for the public good, because this is what it is about at the end, and sort of coming back to research later on? What could be steps that could be imagined at least to go into this direction?
So my first policy fellowship was in California. It was for the California State Assembly. Okay, so this is assembly members that represent districts within California. And it was a one-year fellowship. And I helped pass 2 pieces of legislation. And after that fellowship, I was recruited back to the university and did a postdoc. And I tried to tell my advisory committee of how important it was to work on these 2 pieces of environmental legislation and energy legislation for California. And what I was told was, is it peer reviewed? And I was like, no, it's not. But, Governor Jerry Brown signed it, so shouldn't that, count for something? And they were like, well, sure, but, you need to publish more research papers, Scott, in order to keep going. And
publish.
That was the kind of environment that it's still very prevalent across academia. And, whether that's going to change or how it's going to change is a big question. But at the same time, when I engage with my other colleagues who have worked in policy, they see that value, right? So my peers within the science policy community completely understand that this is important work. But my colleagues back in research, it takes some more convincing. Let's put it that way.
Turning to the panel here, is that a point in Europe too, Liza?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously always going to be a debate. It's going to be a consideration as to the timing that you might participate in something like this. But I think, if I think of kind of key examples of individuals that we've worked with, so I worked with one researcher who went to work in the regulator for the Food Safety Authority in Ireland, and they were looking very much at how their expertise in the area of statistical analysis could really kind of be a change completely the way in which some of the processes working for this organization, and in turn then inform policy. And what this individual said was he had a very strong academic record, had worked a lot with industry, a lot of problem solving, and there was a gap. He hadn't actually worked with policymakers, with public sector, and it was a really he felt a really strong identified gap in his career. That was a gap on his CV. So rather than just narrowly looking at publications, I think we'd like to feel to a certain extent we're moving on from that being the only way to assess somebody's track record. And I know that was a big success, and that relationship has gone on to the future. And that's something as well that can follow on from these fellowships. And it's not just about the individual, it's about going back to that department, to that university, forming those links that go forward. But I think another point that I suppose I feel was a really strong impact was for some individuals, this flexibility. I think there has to be flexibility in the structure. Certainly we found that. So some are longer, some are shorter. Some people can do them part-time because they don't want to completely step away, and it has to be flexible and agile in order to manage all those scenarios. But a really big, I remember one person telling me where it was quite profound, was that they learned a lot during their fellowship, and they were a senior faculty member, and they really integrated that back then into their teaching, which I think, and I heard that from a few of the kind of senior
into
faculty.
the academic teaching.
Yeah, their learnings came back into the teaching.
Into
and they would have said at that stage as well that they wanted to do the fellowship initially because that was their motivation, was in order to see how they could kind of spread the word, let's say, and encourage others to do it. So, there's spillover effects as well as just the immediate task in hand.
Sure. I was tempted to sort of open a debate on how careers in general could be sort of re-envisaged, at least, because this is all about engaging for the public good, as is maternity, paternity, or whatever civic engagement could be sort of maybe something to think about. But as time is already getting short, I thought this would be a very, very long debate, and now I would like to reserve some time for the questions to the audience afterwards. There's one point I really, and it's maybe more important to have this still in this debate, impact. You're doing this different fellowships, pairing schemes, whatever. Tome, maybe you. a few words like on the experience, stepping back a little bit, is impact measurable or anecdotal, but still strong?
Yeah, I mean, there is anecdotal impact, and it's. I mean, what does not happen is that policymaker is going to have a chat with one of our professors, and then he's going to go to the minister and say, "Look, we have to change our legislation. This is not how policymaking works." However, what we do, we lay the groundwork for future interaction. So it often happens that the policymakers are going to invite the researchers to the ministries to give presentations or to participate in background talks. And also the researchers often stay in touch with the policymakers via email or phone. And of course, there are some nice examples. One case, we have a policy-making fellow from the Regional Ministry of Environment. He wanted to learn more about communicating complex issues, and he had a chat with a professor of linguistics who's also doing research on science communication. And after the first meeting, there were several follow-up meetings, workshops, and as a result, the Hessen Regional Ministry of Environment changed their PR guidelines, and there are several instances of such impact stories.
Impact when you drop scientists at the university, at the European Parliament?
Yeah, I would say there's more, in terms of dropping scientists at the European Parliament, waving them goodbye for a week and then picking them up, less direct impact. It's not something that's measurable, and this is a challenge in terms of having that recognition from the scientific community and from scientific institutions. We are still very much in the publish or perish sort of discourse at the moment. We are moving away from it. There are discussions about it. I have witnessed more discussions about it in the recent years. When I first started, it was just the norm, and now there is change happening, for sure. And this other form of impact, whether it's societal or policy, is also being spoken about. I think there's just some key examples of where you can really say, yep, I wrote that sentence, and then the policymakers plagiarized me and they put it in their legislation, but that is extremely rare.
Yeah.
And even if they put your sentence in that piece of legislation, you don't know if it's yours.
Yeah.
There's no way of justifying it. And so I think that is the challenge of really trying to encourage institutions, scientific institutions, to do this work and to recognize it. But it's something that we have to do.
Also, legislation doesn't have footnotes, which makes the quoting difficult, of course.
It's true.
And so on. Scott, the fellowship programs in the US run for quite a long time already. I guess that there is sufficient sort of possibility to take a step back and to have a look on how's the impact on a broader level, not only on the individual researcher, but as a society.
Yeah, no, to Chloe's point, so much of what happens in policy you'll never really know about. I remember having so many ideas going to the California Assembly, and what I very quickly realized was that these ideas were thought of decades before, right? And so how ideas kind of make it into legislation or policy, you follow the history, and it's always a fascinating history. But at the same time, some people only engage in policy once a year. Some people make a career out of it from research, and having different types of opportunities through specific scientific societies, right? That for example, the European Geophysical Union, my society here is the American Geophysical Union, and focusing on climate change, right? You would engage differently than, let's say, venture capital or a business, the science of business. So these types of different opportunities are essential. Different communities need to decide and design them appropriately based on their own kind of objectives. And then longer term fellowships for people who really want to get a deeper experience needs to be available as well. And so I've talked and mentored many students who are interested in science policy, and they all have different curiosity levels or different passions, and so ensuring that the ecosystem can support their interest and their passions is really an important part of that process.
Liza, impact in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that I talked about already, I think actually are really important in the whole area of teaching and feedback loops and creating connections. So again, it's not all about kind of publications at the end. But I know in some of the cases, some of the fellowships, it's really tangible outputs, actually putting in place new classification systems or use case studies that are then taken on board by a particular government department in order to demonstrate efficacy of particular types of technologies. So actually, I'd say, you know, we have not been running this fellowship long, and I think actually there's some pretty tangible outputs actually coming through. But probably the experiential piece is still really paramount and is really important. But what I'd argue, because I'm kind of talking about two different initiatives. So to kind of clarify, we have one which is a fellowship, which is a secondment, which is kind of along the lines of what we're talking about here. The other initiative that I'm talking about is our National Challenge Fund, where we're funding, so we're providing significant amounts of funding to about 90 different research teams. And I suppose where the impact there is really important is, I would argue that if the researchers don't have that engagement with the policymakers, their research cannot be impactful. So it's kind of maybe a slightly different way of looking at it, but there are certain areas now that we're all funding in, this big shift towards mission-oriented policy and mission-oriented research funding, and the research quite clearly is not going to have an impact if those researchers are not engaging with policymakers, if there isn't going to be a route or an avenue for that impact to be delivered. So in some ways it's a bit of a no-brainer. Like, that connection really has to be there if we're going to deliver on our promises and on what we need to do. So it's not really optional, I think.
Yeah. We have less than 20 minutes, so I would like to open to questions from the audience. As there are already 2 questions on Slido, I'll just start with them until the microphone starts swirling around the room. There is one: in how far should scientists take into consideration policymakers' needs when designing a new research question? Anybody a thought on that? It's difficult to say, isn't it?
I would say quite simply, if you want your research to have policy impact, then you need to consider that from the beginning of the research project and the research question. I don't think all research needs to consider the policymakers' needs, but certainly if you want to have policy impact, then yes.
You have to.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think depending on what your ultimate goals are, what stage you're at in your research, I think you need to understand the context in which you're working, and need to understand who's working in that context. So I think at a minimum, you need to understand it. You need to ask the questions. I mean, I think what we find a lot of the time with you know, we try and move away from the kind of technology push kind of idea and look more to policy and context and government needs in order to design your research. And I agree, where appropriate.
Are there any questions in the room? Here in the first line.
Thank you. Alessandro Allegre from the European Commission, DG Research Innovation. So we are, if not directly a research funder, we're in charge of research funding at the European level. And I was thinking many of the realities we've been discussing, they're quite small scale, except of course the American one, which is long running and larger. And I've been thinking, okay, how can we scale it up? Especially in a complex context like Europe, should we look at like many small realities? Should we look at like one big reality that then can, you know, sort of like be the hub that places people around? And also sort of like how do we scale it beyond like, you know, cloning 10 times the 2 MEPs who are actually interesting and 10 times Chloe who run the scheme and so on? How do I go to my colleagues who are in charge of the budget and tell them like, give me €1 million to run a program? Like, how do we institutionalize that further?
I've got an idea.
Chloe, how do we?
So we do have a couple of people here who just started their Blue Book traineeship, who are scientists. And I know other scientists who have done a Blue Book traineeship. And whenever there is the open call for these traineeships, I advertise it to our scientists. It's perfect opportunity, 5 months in the commission, go experience it. Maybe you want to, work in the commission for the rest of your life as your career. Maybe it's just an experiment to see what it is like to be inside a policy-making institution. I think we should advertise this opportunity more to scientists. Maybe we could even make a special Blue Book traineeship just for scientists.
Tome.
If I may add, I mean, it's a great question, and we face the challenge that we often do not understand the potentials of science for policy dialogue. And if I'm allowed to drop some numbers, we accepted about 190 policy-making professionals into our program, and they conducted more than 2,500 meetings with more than 700 researchers, which is a lot, but it's actually only one program at a university network, and such programs can be scaled up. And what we have learned that about 50% of the researchers participating in our programs, they have never been in touch with policymakers before. And the same applies for policymakers. 50% of the policymaking professionals participating in our fellowship programs, they haven't been never or hardly in touch with researchers. So there's a great potential that can be explored by both research institutions and policymaking institutions.
I imagine when you work on these pairing schemes, on these programs, you always have this question like how to ramp it up at the back of your mind. Liza, you're nodding?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's an absorptive capacity in the system as well, and I don't know. I mean, we're only kind of starting out really on the fellowship side, on the secondments, but I think what we feel is really important that it's really kind of high quality. And that individuals going into work in government departments, that they're really well looked after, and that there's a really good kind of mentoring environment that they're working in. We do need to expand it. I think by doing and by demonstrating what we're doing, I think we certainly in Ireland are getting traction. So what we're doing is we have started off through our parent government department getting funding for these initiatives, and as they are rolled out, we are actually being offered cost share from other government departments in order to host the fellows. So I think it needs to see the value, I suppose, needs to be across the board, and you kind of have to earn that as well. But still there's an absorptive capacity and an interest level, but I suppose having that kind of continuously happening and having those individuals feed back then to the universities that they're based in is important.
Thank you. The lady in... No, you were the first one. Excuse me. You come after. But don't worry. The gentleman in the middle of the row. Oh, no.
Then I will
just do one after the other.
Well, just to be not completely negative and support DGRTD in all its efforts that it's performing. I think at a small scale, a lot is already happening for universities. I am myself, Pim de Boer, representing Aurora Universities Network. We also have an alliance, so European University Alliance. And quite some alliances are already engaged in, for instance, soft skill entrepreneurship trainings. So are already working on those soft skills that are needed to, well, understand each other, to speak each other's language, and to get further. So that includes the policy making part as well, being a client. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is to stimulate early career researchers in being engaged in European Union policy making, but also in showing to them that they can also be engaged in the formation of their own careers. So that's what we recently did, asking some of the early career researchers, together with some policy advice from DGRTD and DG Employment, to be in discussion on a topic of interest, something urgent, something very relevant sooner or later, and then ending up with, well, in this case, a white paper that serves as a policy input for the Commission. So that's another thing that is already happening. Then the final point I would like to make, getting scientists into policy making, and that's my own experience, having been head of grants and research at a charity and patient organization, it's not done just like that. It needs intrinsic motivation to do that. However, scientists indeed are still being evaluated based on numericals, the number of publications, students, the amount of grants that they get. But I do hope that the Quora principle, or DORA in the US and REF in the UK, that will change a bit for the better, so that also the recognition and awarding of the, well, let's say the non-scientific part of the work is also being recognized. And that might be helpful in getting them engaged.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Annie, it's difficult to disagree, isn't it?
Okay, my
The
question.
lady in blue, yes. And excuse me for the
Okay,
mix up with the microphone before.
my question goes this way. I'm a PhD student, which make me a researcher, and my research is on the socio-economic impact assessment of Italian-based environmental research infrastructures and how they address global and European environmental challenges. Now, I'm interested in because based on my research, I will be interacting with policymakers, and this this topic is very relevant for me. So, and during the conversation, you mentioned that researchers need to develop skills, and you didn't mention what are these skills. Yeah, I would be interested to know what the skills are. And Scott also mentioned that he mentions he was engaged in a particular policy fellowship program. Can this policy program, can I also be, I mean, can I know more about this policy program because I'm interested in this kind of program? Thank you very much.
Well, I think we touched a little bit on the skills,
Could
but
I-
still.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more on the skills as well. I mean, communication skills, that's come up quite a bit in conversations across various panels today, and I think it's really important to be able to communicate very clearly what your research is about, what area you're working in, very clearly to people coming from different sectors. And what we very much focus on there is ensuring that people articulate, researchers articulate, not, and I mentioned already, not that technology push piece. So from our perspective, I suppose that they very much put forward what it is that they're aiming to address, what the ultimate impact would be from the researcher. And that's probably a lot more likely to get the attention of policymakers that you're speaking to. So to the previous speaker speaking about entrepreneurship, we see so many parallels in the type of conversations that we have with our researchers. We're not talking about business model canvases, we're talking about mission model canvases, but if you can really very clearly articulate what it is that you're aiming to do, how you're going to do it is the kind of the bit that follows. But it's a very simple message, but it actually can be very profound, I think.
Thank you very much. I take your question, I bend it a little bit in asking Scott very simply how to apply for one of those fellowships.
Yes.
Scott.
Right. And just quickly on the skills, I think this is pretty general, but adaptability and flexibility in policy, and those are very, very important because oftentimes researchers, have a very, very specific way of approaching problems, and in policy and in politics, it gets a little bit more complex and chaotic than I would say the scientific process provides. But for applying to these types of fellowships, so some of them are for U.S. citizens. Okay, for example, the fellowship that led me to the Department of State had to be a U.S. citizen because I'm working at the Department of State, and they require a citizen in most cases. But there are a number of fellowships that do allow for international students. Typically, they are enrolled in U.S. universities that allow them to experience state-level policy. And so there's a website, I can't recall it, but I believe a grad student put it together that has a list of about 100 different science policy opportunities. And there is a section on international student engagement and applicability. So I don't know, Olaf, if I can find that link and share it with you later, but there are resources online that have these lists available for those types of fellowships.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one of the sliders questions, the one that has the most thumbs up, and which is one I had at the back of my mind also. I hear a lot about bringing scientists in contact with the policy world, but are there opportunities to teach policymakers the scientific method and its implications? Chloe?
Not that I've done again, but like the JRC has also put a competence framework together for policymakers to help them engage with scientists. So it does exist. I think it's being disseminated. There are people in the audience nodding. Great. It's being disseminated to policymakers. It does exist. But I think there needs to be more. And this is also the thing with pairing schemes, with fellowships. Yes, it's a fantastic opportunity for the scientists, but I think it's also great for the policymakers involved too. Maybe Tome wants to comment on that.
Tome, I was just thinking, if you organize one-to-one meetings, it's basically teaching each other, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And since the meetings usually run for 1 hour, both sides do not have to spend that much time to prepare for the meetings. And we recommend to our policymakers to visit the websites of the researchers involved and to prepare a list of questions they would like to ask. And we also tell them not to be shy and to tell the researchers if they do not understand some things. And this happens on a regular basis. And we ask them to be open-minded and flexible and to admit the gaps the knowledge gaps, which is
so it is clearly that not only the researchers go away with more knowledge, like about another world, but the policymakers do go away with a knowledge about the world of research.
Yes, they do learn a lot because in a face-to-face setting, you actually have to listen to your conversation partner, and they can also ask questions and follow-up questions. So this is a very time-effective way of learning. Yeah.
Well, I guess listening to each other is a great thing, even in a sort of bigger setting like here.
If I could just add one really quick point on
please.
that. Agreeing with all the comments, it's a two-way thing. I mean, I know there are certain schemes of actually, funding policymakers to take time out, and that's not something we're doing just at the moment. Although interested in it as well, but definitely two-way. But I think the setup needs to be really right from the start. So the motivation for participating for both parties has to be very clear from the very start. So this isn't about getting another pair of hands in to do your work. It is about working together, collaborating, co-creating on a particular problem. And if we as the funder, as the broker or whatever, don't see that, we actually don't accept a particular project into the scheme. So, it needs to kind of work for both parties. We also have an interview selection process in which we look at the motivation, but we're looking at the motivation from both sides. So, and I think if that's right from the start, then both should anyway benefit from the experience.
Chloe, there's one Slido question, which is to you. Your pairing scheme with MEPs requires a lot of personal effort and skills from both parties. How can it be reproduced in a durable way? Which is very much ties to Andrea's question.
Similar. I'll just be quick and I'll say there are a lot of other pairing schemes out there, like the one that Tome does. There are so many different ones that you can engage with. It's not just ours. And I would say as the awareness of these pairing schemes grows, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of scientific institutions are making their own, and so more and more are coming every day. Well, every year, let's say, not every day, but yeah.
Is there any more questions in the room? Please, the gentleman there, and afterwards on the side there.
Hello, my name is Hannes. I work here in Brussels for EuroHealthNet as a project manager, but I also work as a research associate for the University of Cambridge, so I have a foot on both sides. And we've touched upon this topic before, especially Scott, when you said that your advisor said any work in policy doesn't really help out a person in their research career. Now, we've also seen that research outputs have increased and increased and increased exponentially where many papers don't even get read. So we also know there are efforts on the way to reform the university system and the how research is being evaluated on European level. So my question would be, what would have to be done on a European level to really integrate work in policy that researchers do into the accreditation system, or in order to make it for them sustainable to work in policy and to advance in their careers on sort of both sides.
Thank you very much. We are running over time right now. Hence, short thoughts on reforming the university system. Anybody volunteering?
I suppose I can not really speak from the kind of European perspective as far as the Commission's concerned, but certainly I know in our evaluation processes we have embraced DORA and QARA, and we are actually in the discussions that we're having at our review panels, it is playing out that we are really ensuring, and we've got interdisciplinary panels who are focusing on those additional outputs, but appreciate that it's still a challenge.
And from the EU side, there's also something that was sort of established earlier this year, maybe last year, the research assessment reform, I think it's called, and I think it's something the EU is involved with. Obviously, that will take time to sort of get people to sign on to it, but change is coming, I think.
Change is coming. One last short question, short
Very
answer.
short. So in other sessions, it was mentioned that we need to widen from science policy to science policy society interface. So the question, what about the interface between science and civil society, in particular with activism and also people like, for instance, Scientist Rebellion?
Strays away a little bit from this panel.
Short question, long answer.
Last long answer then. Half long.
I mean, I would say scientists are starting to engage with society as well. There is actually, just for a plug, there's a Euroscience conference on next Friday. It's also online, that will focus explicitly on science activism and what that looks like and how scientists can engage while maintaining their scientific integrity. So it's coming.
Thank you very much. Now, thank you all. Thank you, all the speakers. For this outstanding discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you all.